And welcome to the Road from Emmaus. I'm Farhan, and along with Kit 2, our desire is to take you on a on a journey of cosmic restoration from creation to consummation. And we hope that you have enjoyed the ride so far. If you're new, this will be a great opportunity for you to jump in as we are jumping into rest stop for today, which is going to be rooted in the Messianic foundation, setting the stage for Jesus's birth. In prepping for this session, Kit and I talked about the idea of really making sure that people understand the two critical tracks that are at play here too. So the first one that we're really going to unpack over the next several minutes is how do we rightly understand these ideas of covenant and history as narrative themes, which really drive us and move us towards, once again, setting the stage for Jesus's birth. But another track which we really want to explore and examine today is what do the prophets have to say about these things too? And what specifically is Yahweh's commentary through the prophets? And how does this insight as well help drive and inform our understanding of the setting the stage for the incarnation? Kid, as we kick off too, because these rest stops are going to be a little bit more form and organic conversation, I'd love for you maybe just to even set the stage in terms of like, why is it important for us to have a right understanding of covenant and history in terms of those being the critical narrative themes, and how do they really ground our understanding in getting to a proper understanding of setting the stage for Jesus's birth? Maybe we start with that question.
Sure. Well, I think that one of the things that Christians understand at some level, but is absolutely foundational, and certainly, in our thinking in putting this together, is this claim of Jesus and the claim of his followers after him that all of the scriptures testify of him. And by that, obviously, it means Israel's scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures. There were no New Testament writings at the time that Jesus lived, and even at the time of the beginning of the testimony to him through his disciples. But this was a constant drumbeat, is that this person, Jesus of Nazareth, is the Messiah promised to Israel. How do we know that? Because we can connect him with all of what the scriptures had to say. So what Christians tend to think is, when Jesus said all of the law, the prophets, and the writings testify of me, they tend to say, okay, yeah, he's talking about Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. Oh, he's talking about Psalm 22, and, maybe 6, 8, a dozen different discrete little passages that seem to be messianic. And that's what he's talking about, Psalm 110, whatever. But really what he's getting at is that the whole of the scriptures taken organically, the whole of the Old Testament scriptures, are indeed the witness to me, Jesus said, in the sense that they built the case for me. They prepared for me. And what we're trying to do here is to say, okay, if all of the scriptures testify of this person, this messianic figure, who again, Jesus himself and his followers said, this guy, Jesus, is that messianic person, then we have to say, okay, how do the scriptures do that? If it's not just a handful of proof texts, how do they actually do that? And we kind of felt it was best to start with just this basic idea that the Old Testament is comprised of kind of two basic sorts of structures. You have the narrative part, the telling of the story part that moves in time and space, and then you have the commentary part, which we largely associate with the prophets, who are commenting and interpreting and, in a sense, representing God's judgment or God's assessment of Israel, what's happening, where they are. So you have that narrative part and the commentary part. And the narrative part, that is the telling of the Old Testament history, is kind of structured, and it very much structured around these things that we call the covenants. The covenants, the biblical covenants, the covenant with Noah, with Abraham, with Israel at Sinai, with David. Those covenants are kind of the main structural skeleton upon which the Old Testament history progresses and through which it must be interpreted. And the scriptures are the record of that Old Testament history. So that's when we talk about, okay, this narrative idea of covenant and history as revealing this messianic figure. That's what we're talking about. And then the second part, as you said, more is the prophets and how they build on that history and interpret that history, ultimately saying this is where this is going. This is what God's been promising and talking about. And then ultimately all of that comes to its kind of point of concentration or convergence on the person of Jesus himself. And as we mentioned before, and we'll see, the gospel writers very much tell the story of Jesus through that lens of Israel's history and the prophetic witness to it.
Like, let's jump into like the narrative themes of that with like a little bit more depth too. There are 6 key ones that we've identified. 2 of we maybe want to kind of go in sequential order, just so our listeners and watchers can really follow along and really make sure that they're staying with us. Talk a little bit about the creation account and the formation of sacred space, and just not only how that set the stage for even where we are and as we shift to Jesus's birth, but how everything really funnels back to that and why it is so critical to make sure that we have that framed up properly.
Well, you and I have emphasized over and over again in the year or so that we've been doing this, that we really have to begin at the beginning. And that may seem, common sense. Yeah, we begin at the beginning. But too often, we, even as Christians, we whatever attention we give to the opening chapters of Genesis, it's more kind of in terms of our notion of, okay, this is a counter explanation, a refutation of evolution, Darwinian evolution. And so what we're seeing here is how God created the world, and he did it in 7 days. That's great. Let's move on. And we've tried to emphasize the fact that what the creation account is doing is giving an explanation of the purpose for creation, the reason, the intent of God in creating in the first place. And that creation account establishes the fundamental structure that is going to characterize God's creation. And those features are that God is creating, ordering, and filling a world that he intends to inhabit and be present in and rule over and in a sense administer his relationship with this creation through a particular creature that is man. And we've talked about how the creation account is really a kind of depiction of God creating a sanctuary. Gods and deities and powers, in the ancient world, they inhabited a temple or a sanctuary. And if God is creating a world and ordering a world that he's going to dwell in, be present in, he's building a sanctuary, a place for him to dwell in. And in ancient temples, the last thing that was done is the construction of an image to be placed in that sanctuary. And that image became the tangible material interface between the deity and the worshiper. And so man is that mediator of the presence and the rule, the relationship of God with his creation. And that's where this human idea of man created to be priest and king, that's where that all comes from. So the first 2 chapters of Genesis really tell us the purpose for God's creation and where human beings sit in the center of that. And as you mentioned, that's really this idea of sacred space. We've used that phrase before, and I think it's in our glossary, but sacred space refers to, again, the point where God's space, God's realm, and the created space or created realm, the realm of the creation, where those 2 things come together. And that was the point of temples. They were the place where the earthly human worshiper could go, a place on the earth, a place in the natural creation that he could go to encounter the God or the deity who inhabited a different space, a different realm of existence. Temples or sanctuaries were where heaven and earth came together, if you want to think of it that way. And that's what sacred space is all about. So we see that the purpose of God is ultimately that his created order would be sacred space, that he would fill his creation and be present in it, and he would rule over it and manifest his character, his love, his wisdom, his goodness, all of these things through this human creature that is his image and likeness. So in the very first instance, we see that God's design for the creation is sacred space in the way that we've just talked about it. And that whole design was undermined and vandalized through this thing that we call the fall. And we don't need to rehearse all that. All of these things we've talked about in the podcast. And so the rest from Genesis 3, all the rest of the way through the whole of the salvation history recorded for us in the scriptures. And by salvation history, again, we mean the history of God working out his purposes to restore and regather and perfect all things, to make the creation be sacred space in the way we've described. Everything from Genesis 3 forward through the whole Old Testament is the record of God's work towards accomplishing that goal. And at the center of that are these things called his covenants, which are themselves relational arrangements that he makes with human beings. If sacred space is where heaven and earth come together, where God is present and operative in the world, well, in a very real way, covenants speak to that idea of sacred space because they're God making arrangements with human beings. It's the bringing together of God and humans, ultimately, again, for the sake of this larger design. So I think that the 6 points that we have here as, okay, what is this large story of the Old Testament? Those 6 points are ordered around these covenant structures that flow out of one another, build on one another, but are all serving this common goal in a cumulative way, which is God ultimately causing his creation to be what he intended it to be, sacred space in that sense.
Building on that too, our second narrative theme was the recovery of sacred space. And there are 3 key things that we talk about in the notes. Talk about the victory over creation's curse, redemption from creation's exile, and the realization of creation's design. Can you speak a little bit more to just the importance for our listeners and our watchers understanding that, yes, there was a spiritual aspect to that, but we need to understand that in terms of a functional pursuit, and that at the end of the day, it was apparent too that the creation was not operating as it was intended to be. And therefore, God's intention was to not only restore the relationship, but to do it in a functional manner so that a thing's true nature could now conform to what it was designed to do. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because so much of the fall, I think, is misunderstood through that same lens, Kit.
Yeah, well, again, we've talked about how in kind of the Hebrew worldview, that ancient Hebrew worldview, the reality of a thing, the truth of a thing was determined through its functional existence. So, maybe in our vernacular, if you say, what is the truth of a microphone? It's that microphone functioning and doing what it was designed to do. And, we've talked before about God, in a sense, delegitimizing the existence of the gods of the nations, even as they're represented in these images, because he says they have ears, physical ears on these images, but they can't hear. They have eyes, but they can't see. They can't speak. And they can't deliver you. God said even in the prophet Isaiah to Israel, when I take you into exile into Babylon, you're going to have to strap your gods onto the beasts of burden to go with you, mocking them that these things can't do anything. They don't have any functional existence. So therefore, they really don't exist in the truest sense. So it's not just that a thing has physical, tangible form or biological existence. It's that it is fulfilling its functional created design. And that's behind the whole idea, as we've talked about, that in the day you eat of it, you will die. At the point that human beings insisted on self-definition, self-determination, that they would manifest and live out their human existence based on their own sense of who they are, their own functionality, their own active, ongoing human existence. The minute that they define themselves from themselves, as opposed to functioning according to the definition and the determination that God had when he brought them into existence. They die to the truth of themselves. They no longer have true existence because their functional existence is now perverted and skewed. And so death came to the human race in that way. But again, when man isn't functioning according to his created intent, which is what? He is to be the interface in God's relationship with his wider creation. That's God's design for sacred space. So when the human functionality and therefore the human relationship with God is distorted or corrupted or, totally broken, then God's relationship with the wider creation is also now broken, because man is the way in which God is present in and carries out his relationship with the wider creation. And that's why in this thing called the fall, you see the ground being cursed. Well, what did the ground do? It didn't sin. It didn't break a commandment. It didn't eat of the tree. Why is the ground cursed? Why is the creation cursed? Well, it's because, again, of this design that God has put in place. So now death and alienation, estrangement, as we've talked, exile, now defines the whole of the created order. So the rest of the story is God showing how and building the case for and working towards ending that exile, ending that estrangement, ending that death, ending that curse, in a sense, bringing the whole creation back to himself, that it would now exist and function according to the design that he had when he brought it into existence. And that's why it's so important to begin with Genesis 1, 2, and 3. It wasn't an accident that that's where the scriptures begin, because if we don't get that part right, then we don't get any of the rest of it right. And then we think, oh, well, it's God has a moral standard and you violated his moral standard and he's angry. Now somebody's got to die, or, whatever it happens to be. Or we think of death, purely in physical terms, or purely in, my soul is going to hell or whatever. And we don't really understand how these things function in a biblical way.
One of the things you spoke to, which I think is maybe an undercurrent in all this, is the idea of sonship. And so what
Right.
we see is, as we advance through this story, and obviously we're moving chapter by chapter at this point too, is we see this prototypical vision, a covenant with Noah on the earth, to speak about the idea, how this idea of sonship is rooted in this idea of a new Adam, a new humanity, and why that is a critical theme for us to not only understand, but it directly supports our understanding of this idea of setting the stage for Jesus at his birth, and how that even ties back to creation. Kind of connect those dots for us.
Well, in the creation account, Adam isn't called the Son of God, but he is called the image and likeness. And that, again, the image idea particularly is more of a functional thing. Man is to be God in the world and unto the world, both in administering God's own life and lordship, his rule into the world, but also bearing back the creation's relationship to God, the priest-king idea. So the language of sonship isn't used there, but, in Luke's genealogy of Jesus, he traces him back in his human descent all the way to Adam, who he calls the Son of God. And that becomes an important insight in this idea of sonship. As you mentioned, sonship isn't just strictly biological descent. It has, once again, a more functional and relational quality to it. It's this basic idea that a son is of the same substance, likeness of the Father, such that when you see the Son being the Son in truth, you will see the Father. And this becomes a theme that Jesus picks up. If you see me, you see the Father. And he's not saying, oh, it's because I'm the second person of the Trinity, and so when you see me as divine, you see God as divine. He's making a statement about this idea, particularly specifically about Israel as son of God, which we've talked about and we'll probably talk about more here. But the Son is of the Father. And so in Hebrew, there's even these expressions, a worthless individual is called a son of worthlessness. Well, worthlessness is a concept, right? It's a moral category or ethical category. It doesn't bear children. But to call someone a son of worthlessness is to say, you are defined by your father. You are defined by this thing called worthlessness. You are a worthless person in that sense. So to ascribe that title of sonship to man says volumes about what it is to be truly human and what it is for human beings to live an authentic human life. I've said to our congregation many times through the years, when we hear Jesus say, when you see me, you see the Father, well, that's our own destiny. When we as Christians are fully, consummately renewed, body and spirit, fully conformed to Christ, then we will be able to say, when you see me, you see the Father, because we will be that perfect reflection and manifestation of God's mind, God's will, God's love, we will be what God created us to be. And it doesn't mean that we're divine like he is, but sonship is a very important theme, and it does emerge as you move through the salvation history. And certainly it emerges in connection with Abraham and the Abrahamic people, Israel collectively as son of God. And then obviously the kings, and that sort of thing in their unique sonship in that regard, the kings of Israel.
Yeah, like we next talked about the covenant with Abraham and how that speaks to the promise of reconciliation, ingathering, and blessing. Without rehashing everything, one of the things that I think was critical too, and we even have it in the notes, speak to this idea of a shift that we actually move from this genealogical family to this idea of a global family, of a global village, right? That will literally encompass and actually encompass the entire cosmos. Why is that such a critical concept for our listeners and watchers to really understand what is actually baked in to that Abrahamic covenant too? Because we spent a lot of time several months ago really unpacking that. Just stamp that again for us, because that's a massive shift in salvation history and understanding the importance of that global family narrative and concept.
Right. Well, one of the patterns that you see in the Old Testament salvation history, and then even through into the New Testament, one of the patterns that God works through is this narrowing, widening from a human standpoint. The scripture starts with one man who then becomes, the family of Adam, the race of Adam. And then that is once again shrunk down to one man, Noah and his family. Noah as a new Adam. This is what you see coming off the flood. A renewing of the earth, a renewing of the human race, a new Adam who is now to be fruitful, multiply, and create a new human family that will fill the earth. That's what comes off the flood. So now we have humanity again widening out, and you see in the Babel event, all of the people of the earth still as one family, one language, one culture, all coming together in solidarity, and God judging that effort to, in a sense, restore sacred space, bring God back down to them. The Tower of Babel episode, God scatters and distributes mankind across the world. And then out of that scattered, fractured, estranged humanity all over the world, he picks out one man. We start with one man again. Abram, we're narrowed back down again. And Abram, his name means the father of a people. And God tells him at the outset, you will become a great nation. I will make you a great nation. I will make your name great. Now now we start widening out again. He has a son, Isaac. He has a son, Jacob. Jacob becomes the man, Israel, Yisrael. And then Jacob himself is widened out in his 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel, the people of Israel. And it's in that way now that God makes Abram a great nation. But he also tells him that in addition to being a great nation, I will make you the father of many nations, the father of many peoples. And part of what came out of the Babel episode is the formation of nations and peoples and cultures and languages. And God is ultimately now taking this one man, Abram, and saying to him, somehow all of that is going to become a part of your family. I'm going to make you the father of many nations, not just one great nation, but many nations. And so the name Avram becomes Avraham, father of a multitudinous people, or many peoples, many nations. And ultimately, we know, if we know the New Testament, at all this design of God, people from every tribe and tongue and nation and people. That's an echo back to the Babel thing. And so now we're narrow again with Abram, but the promise to Abram is that he will be a father ultimately of all of these peoples. Well, how is that? What's the point of that? Where is that going? God says it's through you and through your descendants that my blessing will go out to all the families of the earth. So as Abraham becomes the father of many nations, that's the way in which God will bring his blessing to all the families of the earth, which in the context of, again, the story that the Bible has been telling up to the point that Abraham comes into the picture, God's blessing going to all the families of the earth really speaks to the recovery back to him of this fractured, alienated human race. And so it's out of that idea that Israel becomes son of God collectively. If in a sense, Abram is a new starting point, out of him comes this people. He's kind of corporatized or extended in his descendants, but they collectively are son of God for the sake of testifying of God to the world, so that his blessing would go out to all the families of the earth. And that's where the Abraham story then leads us even to, Israel coming out of Egypt and the next covenant development, that fits into this narrative storyline.
Building on what you just said, kid, speak a little bit to the covenant at Sinai and its implications around these messianic foundations. I think for the first time, we start to really understand this Son of God thing comes back into full form.
Right.
And not just full form, but in the full view and understanding. And we've talked about it even in our last couple of episodes, Kit, people rightly understanding that, yes, Israel, yes, was genealogical, right? There was a heritage, but at its core, fundamentally from a salvation historical perspective, it was a concept too, in that ultimately we must rightly engage and understand Israel as a concept, right? Not not geographical, right? Like not in terms of some of the maybe more default understandings that people apply to Israel, which kind of take them off on rabbit trails and frankly get them stuck quite a bit too. Speak a little bit to just what was happening there, Kid, and why that part of the story is so critical.
Well, the Sinai covenant is important, certainly in our culture and kind of, the medieval, post-medieval Reformation, post-Reformation Christian world that we inhabit, because the Sinai covenant is designated the law of Moses. It's associated with this idea of the law of Moses. And, the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments sit at the center of that. And so in the scheme of thinking that is kind of a part of again, this medieval, post-medieval Christian tradition, what Sinai was about was God's law, an articulation of God's law as a kind of, moral, ethical standard that is the criterion of righteousness by which a person will either go to heaven or go to hell. And so the law becomes kind of, in a sense, one way to be saved if you keep it perfectly. If you don't keep it perfectly, then you go to hell. Oh, okay, well, Jesus came into the world and he kept that law perfectly. And that merit that he attained by perfectly keeping the law gets imputed to us when we believe in him. And so the Sinai covenant is viewed as this thing, law, that in a sense stands in antithesis to the idea of grace or, salvation by grace through faith. So it's law, grace, which is, and in that way, the old covenant, so to speak, the Sinai covenant is contrasted with the new covenant. We're not under the law. We're under grace. We're not under that old covenant. We're under grace. That was for Israel. That was conditional. We're in an unconditional church. And the way we break these things apart in that way really kind of violates the way they function in the scripture. So the law of Moses, the covenant at Sinai, was simply the way in which God was calling back to himself and restating and reaffirming and kind of defining for Abraham's descendants this Abrahamic relationship. Jacob and his family had gone down to Egypt, and now, a couple hundred years have passed. People say 4 centuries, and that's a different discussion. But they had been in Egypt for some time, and the prophets make it clear, and God makes it clear through other ways in the scriptures, that they had forgotten him. They were the Abrahamic people. They were his covenant household. And they go down to Egypt as a family, 70 some people, and God makes them a great nation in Egypt. He enlarges them. He begins to build this Abrahamic people, but they've forgotten him, and they're following the gods of Egypt. And so what he does when he redeems them out of Egypt, is he brings them to this mountain, to this place, Mount Sinai, where he now essentially reestablishes this relationship with them. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You've forgotten me. You have followed after other gods. You have followed in the ways of the Egyptians. Now's the time for me to bring you to myself and reestablish this Abrahamic relationship and the obligation attached to it. So what the Sinai covenant, the law of Moses, is all about is, once again, defining for Israel its Abrahamic identity and vocation, which, as you said, kind of centers in this idea of sonship. A son is of the father, a son, and for Israel, their sonship would cause them to make God known to the nations, and therefore they would be the light of the nations, and the nations would come to know their God. So Sinai is about redefining for them, calling them back to, and recommitting them to their Abrahamic covenant identity and election. It's not some separate, this is a moral code, for you to keep or for mankind to keep or whatever. Sinai is simply, again, the advancing of the Abrahamic, agenda with the Abrahamic people. And that's Galatians 3, where Paul says the point of the law of Moses was to be a pedagogue. It served the promise to Abraham. It served the goal that God had bound up in Abraham. So it's the next stage of development, in this narrative history and in the covenant history with Israel as well. But this is establishing in a formal way Israel's sonship, and God had identified them as son of God to Moses, to even for the sake of Pharaoh, right? Israel is my son, my only begotten son. Let my son go that he might serve me in the wilderness. So that's what Sinai is all about. It's not a separate law covenant that, this is the moral righteousness that God requires or whatever, that is answered, now by Jesus so that we can be saved by grace. And that's probably enough to say about all of that. But these ways that we think about Old Covenant particularly moves us outside of the scriptural, historical, Israelite, Abrahamic context in which it takes place.
So to our last narrative theme is this idea of Israel as a failed covenant. We've obviously talked about and defined sonship too. 3 key things that we talk about in the notes kit too, and feel free to kind of take these wherever you feel led. We've talked about the idea of failed son of Abraham, the idea of false witness to the nations, failed son of God, failed image and regal priest, which we've obviously unpacked quite a bit over the last several months. And then this last note, which I think really synthesizes Israel and how they were defined in terms of their lasting legacy in salvation history, is Israel was to be the solution to the creation's alienation and exile. However, it was itself subject to the same predicament, culminating with the demise of the covenant kingdom. Kit, why is this so critical, especially as we get ready to transition in the next couple of episodes and talk about Jesus' birth? Why is it so important for that to be a lasting reminder and actually a platform for the very reason that Jesus' birth is so critical?
Right. Well, again, what God did when he brought the Abrahamic family out of Egypt, and that's what Israel is all about. Israel, again, was first of all the man, right? The man Jacob. And then Jacob was corporatized in 12 sons. He had his own fullness in 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. And as we keep emphasizing, Israel is not a land in the Middle East. It's not even just people who practice Judaism or who have some kind of, ethnic descent in that way. Biblically, most precisely, Israel refers to the Abrahamic covenant household for the sake of the world. And there is such a thing as an Israel that is not Israel, as Paul puts it. So when God brings Israel, the Abrahamic people, out of Egypt and ratifies this Abrahamic relationship and responsibility at Sinai, this is unto, again, them as son coming and dwelling with him in this covenant land. We've talked about how what made Canaan holy land was the fact that this was the place on the earth that God had marked out to be his own dwelling place. This was where he was going to dwell. So when he brings Israel out of Egypt to bring them to Canaan, he's bringing them to himself. This is what the Song of Moses in Exodus 15 is about. He's bringing his son to dwell with him. This is an echo back to Genesis 1 and 2, right? Dwelling with God in his sanctuary place. And they refer to Canaan as God's sanctuary land. It's his dwelling place. So Israel's residence then in all the following centuries in the land of Canaan spoke to them as God's covenant son for the sake of the world. And their whole history is that of constant unfaithfulness. Israel is an unfaithful son. Israel is an idolatrous son. Zion, who bears these children for Yahweh, is a harlot. She's unfaithful to him. All of this is relational language. It's the language of relational violation. And Zion, the harlot, bears harlotrous children. They're harlots like their mother is a harlot. So whether sonship or wife and children, it's all this relational language that Israel is not faithful in its covenant relationship with God for the sake of the world. And where that ultimately leads, as you've said, and we've gone through it at length in this podcast, is to both of the houses of Israel, all of the 12 tribes being expelled from the land. It's not about being moved away from a piece of real estate. It's about them being sent away from God himself. Again, an echo of Genesis 3. And not only does God send them away, but he forsakes that place. He leaves. And so now you have this complete separation between God and his covenant people. And that's the circumstance in which the prophets begin to, both immediately before that and through that time and coming out of that, all of the prophets in the scripture are kind of focused on this idea of exile and the problem with the covenant household and how it is that God will yet be faithful to what he pledged to Abraham, that your descendants will be the agents of blessing to all the families of the earth, what he promised to David about the kingdom and his house and his throne and all of that, how God is going to actually do that. So Israel's unfaithfulness, that is, the whole huge swath of the story of the Old Testament, is not just a Sunday school lesson about how it's good to obey God, and it's not good to disobey God, and this was a good king and that was a bad king, and this was a good guy and that was a bad guy. This is really the story of how the people who were to be, as you said, the answer to the creation's plight, Israel as the Abrahamic people for the sake of the world, Israel was to be the answer to the creation's calamity. And instead, they themselves were as much a part of that corrupted, alienated, Adamic family of mankind. They couldn't be the solution to the problem because they were a part of the problem. And this creates this tension in the Old Testament story. How will God fulfill this promise through Abraham? If you will, how will he cause the Abrahamic people to be the Abrahamic people? How will he make Israel that isn't really Israel, how will he make it be Israel indeed? And this is the way that the narrative story kind of ramps up and ultimately points to this one Israelite who's to be born. And as kind of a transitional point, this is really at the heart of Isaiah's servant songs. If our listeners are familiar with those 4 servant songs, in Isaiah's prophecy. It picks up this theme of Israel's calling and vocation and their unfaithfulness. Israel's the failed servant of Yahweh, and how it is that Yahweh will raise up from within this servant Israel one who will be a faithful servant.